Michael Jordan's unexpected encounter. It was a quiet, almost nostalgic morning in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the winds of change seemed to carry whispers of memories from Michael Jordan's childhood. As he drove through the streets of his hometown, the familiar landscape had shifted. The towering buildings that now replaced the small, local shops from his youth felt like distant echoes of a time gone by. As the cityscape morphed, so did his thoughts, drifting from the meetings ahead to the memories that had once shaped him. The car came to a red light, and for a fleeting moment Michael's mind wandered. He watched as life unfolded before him, people walking by, unaware of his presence. A young mother with a stroller, two teenagers laughing, lost in their own world, their youth vibrant. But then something caught his eye. An elderly woman, struggling to carry an overwhelming number of grocery bags, her movements slow and deliberate, the weight of the world apparent in her frail hands. At first glance, Michael did not recognize her, just a woman trying to navigate the harsh reality of life. But as he looked closer, a sense of familiarity began to stir within him. The way she carried herself, her slow, deliberate steps, the faintest tilt of her head. It was something he had seen before. As the light turned green, the noise of the world seemed to fade away. Without thinking, Michael pulled his SUV to the side of the road, ignoring the honking horns behind him. He stepped out into the cold February air, every instinct telling him to help. There was something magnetic about this moment, something that felt like destiny itself guiding his steps. He jogged over to the elderly woman, offering his assistance without hesitation. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," Michael said, his voice gentle yet firm as he crouched to collect the spilled groceries. The cans of soup, vegetables, and the bright orange fruit that had rolled into the street seemed trivial compared to the weight of the moment. The woman's voice trembled as she thanked him, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to gather her things. "Thank you, young man," she said without looking up. "These old hands don't grip like they used to." But it wasn't until she looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief, that Michael truly understood the magnitude of this encounter. "My goodness," she whispered. "Michael? Michael Jordan?" In that instant, the world seemed to stop. He didn't just see an elderly woman struggling with groceries. He saw Mrs. Eleanor Winters, his fourth-grade teacher. The woman who had believed in him when no one else did. The woman who had patiently stayed after school to help him with math when his young mind was struggling to grasp numbers, and the same woman who had written him an encouraging note when he was cut from the varsity basketball team in high school, telling him that his greatness would come in time. The flood of memories, the feelings of gratitude, and a sense of awe filled him. This wasn't just an ordinary encounter. This was a moment of reconnection, a moment that would change both of their lives forever. Michael had not known it then, but that simple, seemingly insignificant act of kindness would reveal to him a truth about life, about justice, and about the people who shaped the world quietly and humbly. And so, with a heavy heart and a deep sense of responsibility, Michael helped her gather the scattered groceries. It wasn't just the groceries that needed picking up. It was the realization that someone who had given so much of herself to others was now living in a world that had forgotten her. The woman who had poured love and encouragement into young minds, including his, was now caught in a cycle of hardship that no one should ever face. Mrs. Winters' financial struggles. As Michael carried Mrs. Winters' groceries to her small apartment, the weight of the bag seemed to reflect something much heavier, a reality that was beyond just the immediate physical burden. When they reached her door, she invited him in with warmth, despite the coldness that lingered in the air of her worn-down apartment. As she opened the door, it was clear that every inch of the space, though neatly kept, spoke volumes about a life reduced to the bare necessities. The mismatched furniture, the faded curtains, and the leak in the ceiling that had been left unattended for months were all reminders of a larger, silent truth. This was not a life anyone would have chosen. Sitting down with her in her modest living room, Michael noticed how carefully Mrs. Winters had placed her belongings. Every item seemed to have its purpose, its place. Yet despite the appearance of order, there was an underlying sense of scarcity, both in the physical space around her and in her own life. She had lived here for years, in a building that seemed to be decaying around her, with broken elevators and leaky ceilings, and yet, this was where she had been forced to settle after a lifetime of work, a lifetime of teaching, a lifetime of dedication to shaping young minds. Her words, when she spoke of her pension, struck Michael like a cold gust of wind. "I get by, Michael," she had said quietly, but there was a palpable sadness in her voice that couldn't be masked by her stoic smile. It was a smile that had been worn over decades of teaching, of giving, of sacrificing. She had been a teacher for 40 years, a beacon of hope for countless students, including Michael himself, who had been saved not just by her lessons in the classroom, but by the belief she had instilled in him when the world had told him he wasn't enough. And yet, here she was, living in near poverty, barely scraping by on a pension that barely covered the most basic of needs. "It's just $1,700 a month, Michael," she had explained with an air of resignation. "After rent, utilities, and medications, there's not much left. Some months I have to choose between filling my prescriptions or buying groceries." For a moment, the weight of her words hung in the air like an anchor, pulling Michael into a silent contemplation. He couldn't help but wonder, how could it be that someone who had given so much of herself to others was now facing such injustice? How could someone who had dedicated her life to teaching, to nurturing, to encouraging children, students who had grown up to be doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their communities, end up living in a building with peeling paint and rusted fire escapes, with nothing more than a small teacher's pension to survive on? It was a shocking, painful realization. A woman who had shaped the lives of so many was now invisible to the very system she had served. In her quiet strength, she had never once asked for more than what was given to her. She had worked her entire life for something greater, teaching the future, giving her best every single day, and yet, after retirement, she was left to face a system that seemed to forget the very people who built it. It wasn't just her struggle that Michael saw in this moment, it was the systemic failure that had led her to this point. Mrs. Winter's story wasn't unique. It was part of a much larger, more heartbreaking narrative that many retired teachers across the country were living. The lack of support for retired educators, especially those who had taught for decades, was a quiet crisis that had been ignored for too long. As Michael looked at her, seated before him with quiet dignity, her weary hands holding her mug of tea, he felt a deep sense of anger rising within him. It wasn't just about Mrs. Winters. It was about the thousands of teachers like her who had given everything to their students, only to be abandoned by the very system they had built and nurtured. How many others had been left in the same position, forced to choose between medication and food, between surviving and thriving? Mrs. Winters, with all her grace, never asked for help. She had always given, always been there for her students. But Michael knew that something had to change. Her struggle wasn't just her own. It was a reflection of a much larger, deeply ingrained issue in society. Teachers, the heart of every community, were being pushed aside, forgotten, and left to fend for themselves in their golden years. This was no longer just a personal mission for Michael. It was now a crusade. The anger, the pain, the injustice of it all began to fuel something larger than himself. The very woman who had shaped him as a child, who had taught him how to believe in himself when no one else did, was now in need, and he wouldn't turn away. He had to act, not just for her, but for every teacher who had ever been forgotten in the twilight of their careers. Michael's emotional response and promise to help. As Michael sat in the small, modest apartment with Mrs. Winters, surrounded by the quiet hum of life that had been stripped of its former vibrancy, a sense of heaviness pressed on his chest. The simple setting, the worn furniture, the faded curtains, had all been part of the world he had known when he was a child, but now, in this moment, it felt alien. Here was the teacher who had shaped his future, who had guided him when the world around him seemed too harsh to navigate, living in circumstances that should have been unimaginable for someone of her character and contribution. He watched Mrs. Winters as she spoke with quiet dignity, recounting the struggle she had endured after her retirement, how she had sacrificed so much for the sake of her students, never expecting anything in return, never once asking for special treatment. She had poured everything into her work for 40 years, believing in the power of education to change lives, to create a better future. And yet, in the twilight years of her life, she was forced to make heartbreaking decisions, choosing between medications and food, between warmth and comfort, between dignity and survival. As she spoke, a slow, steady wave of realization washed over Michael. It wasn't just the injustice of her situation, it was the sheer unfairness of it. Mrs. Winters wasn't just any teacher, she was a beacon of light, someone who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She was the woman who had stayed after school to help him with math when numbers danced in his head and seemed impossible to grasp. She was the one who, despite his failures, wrote him a note when he had been cut from the high school basketball team, telling him that his time would come, that he was meant for greatness, even when he couldn't see it. The realization that this woman, who had shaped his future and guided him through some of his darkest days, was now struggling to survive hit him with an emotional force he couldn't ignore. He felt a pang of guilt, a sense of responsibility he hadn't expected. He had risen to heights unimaginable in the world of sports, amassing wealth and fame, while the very woman who had helped him find his way was living in the shadows, forgotten by the very system she had devoted her life to. For the first time in a long while, Michael Jordan felt powerless, not in the way he had when facing down a tough opponent on the basketball court, but in a deeper, more profound way. There were no tactics, no strategies, no victories to be won here. This wasn't about competition. This was about something far more fundamental: humanity, dignity, and justice. As he listened to Mrs. Winters talk about her life and her struggles, a promise began to form inside him. A promise that, as long as he had the power to do something, he would not let this injustice continue. He would not allow someone who had given so much to be left to fend for herself in her time of need. Michael had spent a lifetime achieving the impossible on the basketball court. He had faced down challenges, broken records, and created a legacy of greatness. But what he now faced was a challenge of a different nature. This was not a game. This was real life. This was the opportunity to make a tangible difference, to right a wrong, and to stand up for someone who had always stood by him. "I promise you, Mrs. Winters," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what I can do yet, but I'm going to make sure you get the help you need. I won't let you suffer like this, not after everything you did for me, and for so many others." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. She looked at him with a tenderness that seemed to transcend time. "I didn't do it for the thanks, Michael," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I did it because I believed in you, in all of you." Those words, the belief that Mrs. Winters had placed in him, struck him harder than any victory he had ever achieved. She hadn't asked for accolades, and she hadn't asked for recognition. She had simply given, quietly and consistently, knowing that the true rewards of teaching were not in material wealth, but in the difference made in the lives of her students. Yet here she was, forgotten and neglected by a system that had failed to honor her contributions. And Michael, now moved by both a sense of duty and a deep emotional pull, knew he could not walk away from this. He could not simply go back to his life of luxury and fame, while Mrs. Winters continued to suffer in silence. This wasn't just about helping one teacher, it was about bringing attention to an entire system that had overlooked the struggles of countless educators like her. It was about standing up for those who had given so much and asking the world to recognize their worth, their sacrifice, and their legacy. As Michael stood up to leave, he placed his hand gently on Mrs. Winters' shoulder. "I'm going to help you," he repeated, his voice unwavering. "And I won't stop until this is made right." That promise, made from the deepest part of his heart, marked the beginning of a journey that would not only change his life, but also change the way the world viewed and valued its educators. For the first time, Michael Jordan felt the weight of what it truly meant to make a lasting difference in the world, not through basketball, but through something much more profound: justice, compassion, and the power to uplift those who had been forgotten. The breakfast meeting, a turning point. The next morning, as Michael pulled into the parking lot of the local Denny's, his mind was racing with the weight of his promise to Mrs. Winters. He had spent the entire night unable to sleep, replaying every word of their conversation in his head. The simple act of sitting down with her over tea had ignited something deep within him, something that couldn't be extinguished by the passing of time or the rush of his high-profile life. He knew, now more than ever, that his destiny wasn't just about basketball. It was about doing the right thing. And right now, the right thing was making sure Mrs. Winters didn't face another day in hardship without a plan for her future. As he approached the entrance of the diner, he saw her waiting outside, wearing the same faded blue coat from yesterday, though today she had added a colorful scarf. Despite the contrast of her simple attire with his sleek suit, Michael couldn't help but smile at the sight of her. She had a dignity about her that transcended the boundaries of her circumstances, a quiet strength that he had always admired. "Good morning, Michael," she greeted him with a warm, genuine smile that hadn't changed in all the years he had known her. "You look good," Michael replied, though he couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed in the harsh light of day. Time had taken its toll on her in a way that was both subtle and profound. He had seen Mrs. Winters as a woman of strength and resilience, someone who exuded warmth and confidence, a beacon of encouragement in his childhood. But today, that image felt like it was fading away, replaced by something that broke his heart, a woman who had once given everything to the future of others, now struggling to secure even the smallest comfort for herself. Once they were seated in the booth, a young waitress approached. Her eyes widened when she saw Michael, but the moment was brief. This was not about him. This was about Mrs. Winters, the woman who had once walked alongside generations of children, shaping their futures in ways they would never fully understand. The waitress quickly took their orders, pancakes for Michael, oatmeal for Mrs. Winters, and disappeared, leaving them in the silence of their shared space. Michael's mind was swirling as they sat across from one another, the quiet hum of the diner's everyday life contrasting with the enormity of the conversation that was about to unfold. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside him that told him he was meant to do something more. The question was, what could he do? What was the right way to help? "Mrs. Winters," he began, his voice gentle but unwavering, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the pension, about your struggles, and I can't help but wonder, how did this happen? How did a woman who spent 40 years shaping young minds, including mine, end up in a situation like this?" The question hung in the air between them, neither of them rushing to fill the silence. Mrs. Winters stirred her coffee slowly, her eyes drifting to the window as if she were looking for the right words to explain something that had no easy answer. "It's not a very exciting story," she said finally. "I taught for 40 years, loved every minute of it. I poured myself into my students, and Harold, my husband, we had plans. After I retired, we were going to travel, enjoy life, but then Harold got sick, cancer. It was 3 years of struggle, 3 years where nothing seemed to go right. The medical bills piled up and insurance covered only so much. We had to take out a second mortgage on the house just to stay afloat." Michael's heart tightened as he listened to her recount the painful truth of her situation. For so many teachers like Mrs. Winters, life after retirement was supposed to be a time of peace and relaxation, a reward for decades of hard work. But for Mrs. Winters, and for countless others, that reward had been replaced by a cruel series of events that had led to the loss of everything she had worked for. "And when Harold passed, I couldn't keep up with the bills anymore," she continued, her voice faltering for a moment. "I sold the house 2 years ago and moved into the apartment. It's not much, but it's what I could afford. I never expected this. I never thought that after all those years of service I would end up living like this." Her voice had softened by the end, a quiet resignation in her tone that seemed to speak of the unspoken pain she had carried for so long. She hadn't just lost her husband, she had lost the life she had envisioned, the future she had dreamed of, and the system, the very system she had devoted her life to, had left her behind in her time of need. Michael listened intently, but inside, something was changing. He had spent his life chasing championships, breaking records, living in the limelight, but none of that had ever prepared him for the weight of what he was hearing now. He had always known the value of hard work, the value of overcoming obstacles, but the story Mrs. Winters was sharing with him now wasn't about sports. It wasn't about competition. It was about survival. As she finished explaining the details of her struggles, the second mortgage, the lack of insurance, the pension that barely covered her most basic needs, Michael felt something inside him shift. His purpose, once so clearly defined by basketball, now seemed secondary to something greater, something far more important. He reached across the table and placed his hand gently on hers. "Mrs. Winters, I can't just sit here and let this continue. It's not right. You gave everything to your students, to your community, and now you deserve to have what's rightfully yours. I promise you I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this gets fixed." The resolve in Michael's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a fleeting promise. This was a commitment. He wasn't just promising to help one teacher. He was pledging to help an entire system of teachers who had been forgotten, who had been abandoned by the very system they had helped build. Mrs. Winters' eyes softened, her hands trembling as she squeezed his in return. "Thank you, Michael," she said quietly. "But I never did it for the thanks. I did it because I believed in you. In all of you." Michael's heart swelled with emotion as he looked at her, this woman who had given so much of herself and asked for nothing in return. He had seen so many accolades in his life, so many moments of recognition and adoration, but in this moment, sitting across from Mrs. Winters, he felt something far more meaningful than any championship. He felt the weight of what it truly meant to give, to sacrifice, and to make a difference in the lives of others. Michael's plan to make a difference. After his breakfast with Mrs. Winters, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. The simple act of helping a former teacher had revealed a deep, systemic issue, one that he couldn't ignore. As he drove back to his hotel, the streets of Wilmington faded behind him, but the weight of Mrs. Winters' situation remained firmly planted in his mind. He had always been a competitor, a man driven by a relentless pursuit of greatness, whether on the basketball court or in the business world. But this was different. This wasn't about records or victories. This wasn't a challenge he could overcome by sheer willpower or talent. This was about justice. It was about ensuring that people who had given so much of themselves, people like Mrs. Winters, were not left behind, forgotten by the very system they had helped build. The more Michael thought about it, the more the anger inside him began to grow. It wasn't just Mrs. Winters. It wasn't just her struggle. The more he learned, the more he understood that she was a representation of a much larger, unseen crisis. She was one of thousands, maybe millions of retired educators who had given their lives to shaping young minds, only to find themselves living in poverty after decades of hard work and sacrifice. Teachers who had spent years nurturing the future of this country, only to be pushed aside in their retirement, left to struggle for survival. And the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a personal failure, it was a systemic one. A system that had failed to provide teachers with the dignity and care they deserved. A system that had placed the responsibility for their futures on their own shoulders, with little to no support once they had given everything to their communities. For Michael, the path forward was clear. He couldn't just sit back and acknowledge the injustice. He had to act. This was no longer just about helping Mrs. Winters. This was about creating a movement. A shift in the way America viewed and treated its educators. The following day, Michael made a phone call to his business manager, Tristan. His voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it that Tristan recognized immediately. "Tristan," he said, his tone unwavering, "I need you to cancel all my meetings for the next few days. I'm not rescheduling this one. We're going to do something about this." "But sir, the investors are already here." "I don't care," Michael cut him off. "This can't wait. Start researching everything you can about teacher pensions and retirement benefits. Find me the best elder care attorney in North Carolina. And I need a team of people who can help me understand how we can change the system for good. This is bigger than any business meeting I've ever had." The words hung heavy in the air. Michael wasn't just shifting his priorities, he was reshaping the trajectory of his life. He wasn't content to simply pass by this injustice and let it fade into the background. He wasn't satisfied with just offering Mrs. Winters a check and calling it a day. No, this was about fixing something broken, something much larger than one person's hardship. His focus now shifted entirely. He pored over reports about teacher pensions, learned about the state of retirement systems for educators across the country, and began to understand just how deep the crisis went. The more he read, the more determined he became to bring about real, lasting change. He wanted to not only help Mrs. Winters, but to help thousands of teachers like her. Teachers who had been let down by the system they had given their lives to. Teachers who had spent years in classrooms pouring their hearts into their work, only to be discarded when they were no longer useful to society. The more Michael thought about the problem, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about pension funds or insurance policies, it was about values. It was about honoring the people who had shaped the minds of the next generation, who had poured their hearts into teaching, and who had done so with little regard for personal gain. It was about ensuring that teachers were treated with the respect they deserved, not just in their prime years but in their retirement as well. And so Michael's plan began to take shape. He called for a national initiative, one that would advocate for improved teacher retirement benefits, increase pension security, and provide better resources for educators in their later years. It wasn't enough to write a check and walk away. He wanted to create a movement that would change the way educators were viewed and supported, a movement that would honor their contributions to society and provide them with the financial security they deserved in their retirement. But Michael knew this wouldn't be easy. The bureaucracy, the politics, the entrenched systems of power, it would all stand in the way. But that didn't deter him. Michael had faced impossible odds before, and he had overcome them with determination and grit. This was no different. He would not let Mrs. Winter's story, and the stories of so many teachers like her, go unheard. He would not stand by as these educators continued to be overlooked by a system that had benefited from their labor for decades. With his plan in place, Michael began reaching out to lawmakers, education advocates, and organizations that supported teachers. He spoke at conferences, wrote letters, and used his platform to raise awareness about the plight of retired educators. Slowly, but surely, his message began to spread, and a movement began to grow. As the initiative gained momentum, Michael couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. His life had been filled with success, accolades, and fame, but this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about making things right. It was about ensuring that those who had shaped him, those who had shaped so many others, would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The shocking revelation and nationwide impact. The initiative Michael Jordan had launched to address the financial struggles of retired teachers was gaining momentum. His determination to make a difference, which had started with Mrs. Winters, had blossomed into a nationwide movement. As Michael spoke with lawmakers, attended conferences, and used his platform to advocate for teachers' rights, something inside him continued to drive him forward. A sense of justice, a sense of duty, but amid all the changes and progress, there was still one more truth waiting to be uncovered. As part of his research into teacher pensions and retirement benefits, Michael decided to visit Mrs. Winters once more. He wanted to update her on his progress and discuss the next steps in the fight to improve the lives of teachers across the country. But when he arrived at her apartment, she seemed different. There was a certain quietness about her, a subtle shift in her demeanor that made Michael pause. "How are you, Mrs. Winters?" he asked, his voice gentle yet filled with concern. She smiled, but the warmth in her eyes was tinged with something more reserved. "I'm fine, Michael, just fine," she replied, though Michael could tell that something was weighing on her. She had always been a woman of strength, of quiet resilience, but in this moment she seemed almost distant, lost in thought. As they sat down, she asked about the progress of the movement, and Michael shared the exciting developments. The strides they had made in bringing awareness to the plight of retired educators and the growing support for better pension programs. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Mrs. Winters listened, nodding, but there was a distant look in her eyes, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. "Michael," she said after a long pause, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I've kept to myself for years. Something that you need to know." Michael leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. He had always admired Mrs. Winters for her honesty and integrity, but the weight in her voice made him feel like he was about to hear something that would change everything. "I've never told anyone this," she continued, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "But the truth is, I didn't just teach you math, Michael. I didn't just teach you fractions, or help you with your homework." She paused, as if struggling to find the words, and then looked him directly in the eye. "I knew about your basketball talent long before you did. I saw it in you when you were just a kid. But I also knew something else, something I never shared with anyone. You see, Michael, the day you were cut from the varsity basketball team, the day I found you hiding in the gym bathroom crying, I didn't just offer you encouragement. I told you that you would make it because I knew you would. I knew it. Michael blinked, taken aback by her words. He had always known that Mrs. Winters had believed in him, but he had never realized the depth of that belief, how she had seen something in him that no one else had seen, something that went far beyond basketball and into the very core of who he was. But there was more. I also knew about the secret coach, she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. The one who believed in you too. The one who had been watching over you since that day. You see, when you weren't selected for the varsity team, when you were devastated and felt like your dreams were over, I was the one who encouraged Coach Smith to give you a chance. I was the one who told him that you had something special, something that no one else could see. The weight of her words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Winters had been the one who had opened that door for him. She had seen the potential in him even when he couldn't see it himself, and had taken the step to advocate for him when it mattered most. But what struck him even more profoundly was that, through her quiet belief in him, she had somehow changed the course of his life. He sat there, stunned, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just revealed. The revelation that Mrs. Winters, the woman who had been his teacher and guide, had played a pivotal role in shaping his career was something Michael could never have imagined. In the very moment that had felt like his lowest point, when he thought his dreams were slipping away, Mrs. Winters had been the one to ensure he had a chance that would change everything, a chance that would lead him to the NBA, to greatness, to a legacy that extended far beyond the basketball court. Why didn't you ever tell me this? Michael asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Mrs. Winters smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Because, Michael, I didn't need to. You were always going to make it, I knew that. But more importantly, I wanted you to know that I believed in you. That belief was more important than anything else. In that moment, the weight of everything Mrs. Winters had done for him and for so many others hit Michael harder than any championship win or career achievement ever had. This was not just about basketball. This was about the unseen, quiet acts of love and belief that had shaped him, and countless others, into who they were. As the conversation continued, Michael found himself profoundly moved by the knowledge that Mrs. Winters had been so deeply invested in his success, not just as a student, but as a person. The revelation changed everything. It deepened his commitment to her, to the cause he had taken up, and to the teachers across the country who had been quietly shaping futures in ways that would never make the headlines. But the impact of this revelation didn't stop there. Michael now understood that Mrs. Winters wasn't just a teacher. She was a key figure in his entire journey, someone who had connected the dots in his life when no one else had, someone who had recognized potential long before he did. And in turn, it solidified Michael's resolve. This movement was no longer just a fight for fairness. It was a personal mission, one that tied directly to his own story, his own success. It was about giving back to the educators who had given everything to him and to so many others. Subscribe to our channel and comment below on how a teacher has impacted your life. Let's make a difference together.